Okay, so the next thing we're moving on to is our main frames. I've actually made a little bit of a head start on this and just installed some of the simple items onto this frame before we get into the more complicated parts of putting it together. So we've got one of our engine mounting blocks installed here, the two grommets which fuel tube go through. We've got our tank surround. I've put the canopy post on as well, single screw through a washer into the canopy post. And also I've mounted up one of our little servo holders which the servo screws screw into. You look at this from the other side. If I just show you this from the other side, you can see you've got holes here that the servo screws will go into, and it's held on with a single screw here. Okay, so some basics done to begin with. The next thing we're going to mount into here is our clutch stack, and I need to build that up first. So the next thing we're going to look at is the clutch stack. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be working on is our clutch bell, and the first thing to do is to install the two bearings here onto the shaft and to use some Loctite to secure those in place. And this is the T43 that Align put in the kit. Then we want to put this nut onto the end and screw it up, and that requires some blue Loctite on it. Okay, so this piece is now bolted together. Next thing we want to do is to take this shaft and insert it through. A little bit of pressure to make that go through there. We go like that, and then once we've got that on there, the next thing we can do is put a small bearing on it, like so. Now this bearing again needs to be Loctited onto the shaft, so I'll do that off camera. Okay, so there we have the bearing in place, and you'll notice that there is a gap here, and that is actually equivalent to the gap that you'll get in the moulding that this is going to fit into. So this effectively fits in there like that, and you can see that the bearing sits down in that moulding, and that's the gap you need before the Loctite goes off and welds that bearing in place, and then you can't move it. Okay, so once you've done that, you're then in a position to put this headpiece on, which has two grub screws on it, which locate into the two recesses on the shaft for those grub screws. So Loctite on the grub screws, put that on, tighten the two grub screws up, and then that's the mechanical assembly of the insides of it done, and we can then put the casing around it. Okay, so there we have that piece finished. This top piece goes on such that you can see the hex starter hole at the top, and we can now put our outer casing around that. So I've got one of those casings here. That goes on there like that, and then the other casing goes on the other side. Pushes together like that. Once we've done that, we can then put the nut into one side, and then a Allen head bolt goes to the other side, and you tighten those up to hold that plastic casing in place. The last thing to do with this clutch stack is to insert these metal posts which go through the plastic moulding here, and these literally just push through, so you put them in, push them through, and that's it. And that's now ready for bolting into our frames. Okay, next we need to assemble the control horn for the tail. This is it already assembled. It doesn't come assembled in the kit, I've actually already done this. But basically you have to put a ball above and below the arm here, and then bolt this arm down onto this metal bracket below. Bear in mind there is a little washer that goes above and below this control horn before bolting it into this bracket below. And once you've done that, that can be bolted into the frames, and it's done with these screws and washers. The other thing we need to bolt into our frames is our canopy protector. So this kind of holds the canopy away from the frames using this rubberized piece here. And this is a frame spacer effectively that goes between, and then you get another one of these rubberized ones the other side on the other frame. Okay, and that's one half of our frame complete for this particular build step. You can see I've got the frame spacer there and our canopy spacer the other side, and then the control horn here is mounted. And as you can see, on the inside of the frame you have the ball facing upwards, and on the outside of the frame the ball is facing down towards the tank. This build step in the manual also shows mounting up the sensor for a governor. I'm actually using a different kind of sensor on this machine that won't be sensing at this point here onto the clutch stack, so I'm not actually installing that at this point. But if you were to be using a sensor that's going to be mounted into the top of your clutch bell, then you need to put that on now, because this is really hard to get to later on once you put the frames together. Okay, here are all the items we're going to be installing onto our frame side next. I've got the clutch stack which we built earlier. These are our main shaft bearing blocks, then braces which go at the bottom of the frames. This is the servo mount which I've already installed the canopy post onto. This little servo mount is for a Carb Smart or a mixture control servo. We've got a frame stiffener and our radio tray. So those are all going onto our frames next. They're all mounted with the same bolts, which are these fellows here. Okay, so here we have those components installed. We've got our battery tray installed on the front here. We've bolted in our clutch stack. We've got our main shaft bearing blocks installed, and then if I show you from the other side, you can see the frame stiffener at the back here with our frame brace underneath, and our mixture servo mount again with our frame brace underneath. So the next thing we want to do now is install the tank into the space here, and then once we've got the tank in, we can offer up our other side frame and bolt that into place. Okay, so there we have our tank inserted into the frames, and you can see that the fuel nipple here is the other side. Now when I put this tank in, it is extraordinarily tight in that rubber surround, and it's very likely that at maiden flight we may discover that we've got fuel foaming problems because of how tight that is in that rubber surround. But if we do have fuel foaming, then we'll have to take the tank out and widen the frames with a Dremel to give it just a little bit more space and allow this rubber to work a bit better to dampen vibrations. The other thing to mention is that the bearing blocks here, you don't want to tighten those up yet. So as you can see, mine are still loose. You don't want to tighten those up properly until you've got the main shaft through those. Otherwise these can be misaligned slightly, and it can give you problems with wearing out the bearings, the main shaft bearings, too quickly. Okay, so that's now ready for us to offer up our other side frame and bolt it into place. Okay, here's our other side frame, and there's a few things to install into this before we put it on. I've put the canopy post in with the nut and with the washer and bolt the other side. We've again got one of these servo holders bolted into place, the tank surround, and I've also got an engine mount on there as well. And that's all you need to put onto that before you can offer that up for bolting onto the other side frame. So if I just bring our other side frame over and go on like so, and we can now put a couple of things onto this. There is a frame brace that goes up the back here, get that on the right way like that, and there is also a frame stiffener can get this right as well, which goes on there like so, just to stiffen up the front of the frame here. And with those two pieces in place, we can now just put all of our various screws in to bolt it together. Again, don't do up the screws at the top here that go into the bearing block, those should just be loosely installed at this stage. We have our frames put together. We've installed the bung into the outside hole on the tank. We will use the inside hole there for our main fuel lines, and the reason for doing that is so that the clunk can equally reach both sides of the tank, whereas if you use this outer hole you can have problems with the clunk reaching all the way across to the other side of the tank. Also, something else to note is that on this side we have 2 grommets installed. On the other side we just have a single grommet in the lower hole, and that's our frames installed. Also, we haven't tightened up these bolts on the main shaft bearing blocks. We won't do that until we've installed the main shaft down through there. Okay, and there you see the bung installed, and if we look you can see the clunk line inside the tank there. So having got that installed, it's time to install the engine, or if you really are quite fastidious about not wanting to fiddle around, it could be a good idea to actually put some fuel tubing onto the bung there at this point to save you fiddling around trying to thread it on later.